United States, and maybe the mortgage sector and the financial sector has really affected them to such a point that, we were lectured on what we should do. The orthodoxy of the monetary fund, the World Bank, that this is the way you should do because we have successful economies. Now, I just gave a speech saying that. Unfortunately, the successful economies that you regulated, privatized, and the rest are now having a social cost that will cripple them. Last year I was 2 times in Greece, and you will probably lose 1 or 2 generations. And I'm not talking about the economics of this, I'm talking about the social cost. Because if you have a young couple who are masters in whatever they studied and can't get a job, and have to go back to live with their parents, and their parents have 40% of their retirement cut, and there's no viability of getting this, you see a spasm of no hope in a society. And this is happening in the educated Europe, which was lecturing to us in the 90s and the 80s on orthodox manners of doing this. I do think that has to deal a lot with how they are reacting in this realm. When I see that there is resistance to saying, from Accra to now we have had a financial crisis, they say, no, we haven't. No, why put financial crisis? There's no financial crisis. No, we're getting over the financial crisis. But if I were the subject, and I was in the 90s, in 98 I had 80% of my banks failed, and I was crucified. I was applied the most rigorous standards of orthodox economics and trade and so on, and my debt and my bonds were 15% of the markets and so on. So I know what I'm talking about when I say, the social cost of measures of that type are extremely high. And you just saw what happened in the election in France on Sunday. So you're living in a new dimension where emerging economies have a new role to play, and some of them are pushing them to take that role up, and some of them are reluctant that they do. This is a power struggle. They're reluctant to leave their sequences. China is a very big factor. So I do think that you have to look at this as a new sequence of events that happens when you have these meetings. I am a career diplomat, so I deal with this on a professional level. If you look at this from a point of view of strategies, it's extremely logical. You see, only 10 countries speak English and know the language and can be flexible with terminology. We don't speak English. This is probably the 2nd or 3rd language, so we innovate with terminology that sometimes makes it more complicated because we presume to know the language, and then we complicate the negotiation tremendously. And if you're negotiating this in English or in French, and then you go to 5 languages, the streamline of English goes to Russian, and then you really hit the fan. So in reality, it is a complexity of the system. You're seeing a phenomenon with the European Union. The European Union has multiple benefits to a community-based system, but in negotiation it has been terrible for us, for bilateral. Because before we would talk to France, we would talk to England, we would talk to... Now they get together in Brussels, they decide, and they lock. Getting them out of that lock is extremely difficult, because they have to go back to their constituents here. That means the other countries that sometimes agree or not agree, and they are immobile. And when you're immobilized, you act in a different way. You push. And when you push, you normally look at the subject matter, and suddenly the European Union is sponsoring Palestine resolutions. This type of thing. Okay? So, because it cannot go back and say, you're right, there is a financial crisis in Europe. You're right, we're talking about deregulation. We should regulate markets. We were talking with Deborah about Christopher Dodd, who unfortunately left the Congress because he wasn't going to be reelected because of the Dodd-Frank bill, and Barney Frank, who regulated the markets because it became a free-for-all. But there are very strong forces in the American Congress to deregulate what the Dodd-Frank bill did. You're seeing a scenario internationally which is much more complex because the WTO has not been in agreement for the last 10 years or more. So in trade, there will be no agreement. I was chair of the conference on disarmament in January, and on disarmament, there will be no agreement. Physical materials are not issues that countries like to negotiate. Rio plus 20, will we have an agreement at Rio plus 20, or will we have a repeat of Cancun and Copenhagen? So we came to Doha as UNCTAD under the possibility that we would not have a document. And for my delegation, to be extremely honest, if we do not get a good document, we prefer not to have it. We would go back to agreed language in Accra. But they don't want Accra. Because you see, Accra was much more evolved than what they will get here. And that is the major question. Because agreed language, according to our precepts in international negotiations, is agreed language. And that language stays. The new agreement always relates to the mandates it had. And I really remind you, UNCTAD is not going to disappear, it's not going to, except if they cripple it financially, which is in the 5th committee. I'll also make a very brief criticism of diplomacy in different fora because since the ministers of trade meet in one realm and the ministers of relations in the other, and the ministers of health in the other, and the ministers of environment in the other, sometimes they don't have the same positions, if I may put it very delicately. You'll find countries that have positions in one forum and they have completely different positions in the other. And that is reality, because we deal with these things. You know, how can you say this? If you voted this way in the General Assembly, why don't you vote the same way here? Because it's understandable that a resolution was passed in the General Assembly, but those who didn't vote for it or abstained said it's not an obligation for me. So therefore, that resolution is not binding. And if you see the sequence of negotiations, we had a fist fight this morning because we said, in the Human Rights Council, there's a resolution on the right to food. And we approved it. And the Jewish guys came up and said, okay, so it's agreed language, it shouldn't be here, because it's in another organ. And then, you know, this is a strategy, because if you look carefully at the language they are proposing, you see that they're intelligent enough to propose a language which seems to open, but simply turns it around, so when you actually read the paragraph integrally, you might be off worse than the others, but this is not rationalized linguistically. So you stop it and say, no. But the actual problem we have now is that there is an evolution, I would say a positive evolution in the majority of the document that's being negotiated downstairs. And the hardcore issues are upstairs. And well, they're upstairs because they have a smaller group, and the more you know, our representatives are there to do that. And you have positions that are defendable and have to be defended. So I do think that this is the dynamic. Where do we go from here after a document in Doha? Suppose we do. Because there's also a declaration of Manara, which the Qataris do. Normally, the UNCTAD always gives the host country the opportunity of making a political declaration on the basis of this. It's sort of chapeau. But one of the things you will have is that what happened in the 80s when you had the GATT and the 90s with the Washington City, you evolved into WTO. It was almost a sentence of death for UNCTAD. Because they came back and said, why? To study. Why? Market forces are there. They regulate themselves. This is the best of the worlds. The paradigm of change is here. Communism has fallen. The wall has fallen. This is, you know, the Western societies, and when you look at that, we had a very tough time in the 90s to keep UNCTAD alive. And we had to do a lot of work substantiating what the work was about. How can you say that there's no financial crisis and there is no implication of financial crisis in trade, and since it is a financial issue, it is dealt in other organizations? That is a position by one of the most powerful countries in the world. So no, you know, your financial crisis impacts me, and impacts my trade, and impacts my livelihood, my social structure. So I do think that there is a philosophical debate and an ideological debate, if you wish, but there is a debate happening in these corridors because the world changed, and they're saying, well, since it changed in Accra is not valid. Okay? For us, it is, and it's agreed language, and we will keep it. But that's where the G77 and China have a problem. The other problem is that the emerging economies, so the emerging economies, the larger economies, the BRICS, are being called into order and saying you have to contribute. You want to be members of the Security Council? And this fistfight is a geopolitical power play between them. And it's an interesting one because I find that in many of the cases, the smaller economies of the world, looking into my region, which I know more, Ecuador is growing at 9% for counter-cyclical measures that apply to the crisis. And, you know, we tell our friends, you should look more at what we're doing in order to have less inequality, less unemployment, less unemployment. We've been very successful in this. But also, one of the things that worries me a lot is this double language between the organizations. It's always worried me. This is very personal for me, because I deal a lot in human rights. But human rights doesn't have a footing in human activity, in productive human activity. Human rights does not deal in the issues of a productive activity. It does not deal in women's rights and slavery and torture and a lot of things. But in the streamline as a horizontal issue of saying, look, all activities by human beings have to be under a realm of guidance of human rights. When it comes to transnational corporations, when it comes to human activity, no, you know, we don't know about that. WTO will not deal with issues. So it's a sort of a segment here, a feudal group, because I don't believe in these things, because we're the same representative. And we sit down in different organizations that talk differently, with different languages. So my impression is that what we're facing today is a pressure point going on a negotiation that has been happening for 6 months. I think continue today, probably beyond 9 o'clock and whatever. And they'll sit down and we'll have a bureau meeting tomorrow at 8 and look into this issue, because there is a time factor in which if it is not given to the Secretariat at a certain point, you need or to change the rules by consensus of all, or you may not have it done. Technically. Not substantially. Because substantially we're still, there are differences here. And of course there are differences. We're human beings, we're a different society. We have tremendous differences between one and the other. We look at life in different ways, they look at life in different ways, and we don't really agree upon this. So the rule of consensus is very difficult to reach. In international relations, in these parliamentary negotiations, consensus means no active opposition. It does not mean that you agree. It means that you're not acting against what is said and therefore are not blocking it. Do not be mistaken by the word consensus that everybody's happy and all of us are. No, you can negotiate consensus. So we're at that point. I think that, I won't get into the details, besides their very dynamic details. They are clearing paragraphs very rapidly downstairs. And I think we'll have a substantial, but the sticky points will be the sticky points until the end of the negotiation. What I was trying to convey to you is that this is happening all over. It's not happening only in UNCTAD. It's happening in other fora. And for me, it's a crisis of multilateralism. It's a crisis in the way countries, state parties who created these organizations are dealing with these organizations, because there are new actors, international actors, that are not only state parties, they are NGOs who have a very important participation in the community, in the international community. You have transnational corporations, which are massive entities of profit, and that have a substantial influence in what we're doing in the world. And you have individuals and human rights, even on an individual level. So the world changed from 1945 to now. And the world has to change an organization like the United Nations that does not respond to the 194 members that it has. It was created for another world, and which is rapidly ending in its way of dealing with this. The Security Council has to be changed. The Security Council was created with 5 permanent members with veto, and we expanded it once with 15 members. But that was when we were 60. Now we are 194. It has to become more effective in internal struggles, civil conflict, which it was not deemed to be. And you can pick any one of these. This is my personal point of view as a diplomat. That in order to be effective, you have to have a system that responds with certain speed and dynamic and opportunity to the realities of this. A report 3 years later on what happened now is worthless. We need an UNCTAD that is effective and that can give us reasons and can act as a think tank to tell us, well, this is... And this is the only organization that anticipated the crisis that we were having, that was coming to the financial markets because of the law. In my personal position and my instructions from my government, we're going to defend it because we think it has a valuable role. That is not the situation in some of the countries that we're here. They think it duplicates, it shouldn't be, it shouldn't work. And this is why we're having this problem. But this is a normal negotiation, so we will spend the long hours from now on trying to get to an agreement. I am an optimist at heart, and I do believe that God is with us, so we will have an agreement. If we do not have an agreement, we will stand by ACRA, and unfortunately that would be very divisive if the other countries do not agree on a consensus document. But those are things that have to pass, because I do believe that in crisis you also have opportunities. And we are in a situation at this moment in the world where the activities of the crisis are affecting those who would pontify about the solution, and therefore they're caught between a rock and a hard place because they don't know exactly how to deal with this. Maybe if they looked at us, they would learn a lot. But that is for another conversation. Thank you very much for receiving us here. And, the Ecuadorian delegation is with me. I don't know if my colleagues want to say something, but I'm very happy to be meeting with you, and it's always an honor and a pleasure. And with good friends like Deborah, she and I worked in Washington against the Blue-Eyed Devils, although she is one of them. Well, thank you very much. God be with you.